Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? Is this working? Any better? Okay, good. Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Centre. I'm Peter Reid, one of the Vice Presidents here at the Centre, which most of you know is the living memorial to the nation's 28th President, its first internationalist President, and its only PhD President. Jane Harman, our President and CEO, apologises for not being here today. She's currently departing Myanmar, where she's been with Aung San Suu Kyi at a democracy building conference, and presenting her with the Ion Ratu Democracy Building Award. And she's en route now to meet the Prime Minister of Thailand before heading on to Korea. Our guest today is Lord Lothian, formerly Michael Ancram MP, who was first elected to the British Parliament in 1974 and served as a Conservative MP until his retirement in the May 2010 general election. He was subsequently appointed to the House of Lords as a life peer. During his substantial career, he has held posts of Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party, Shadow Foreign Secretary, Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, and since 2005 he has been and continues to be a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee. My first encounter with Michael was when he was appointed Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Northern Ireland Office. Shortly after that he was promoted to Minister of State, basically Deputy Secretary of State, and was responsible for the negotiations that led to the Northern Ireland peace process. In fact, he was the first British minister in 25 years to meet with Sinn Féin and the IRA, a meeting that was critical to our future success. Michael is a descendant of the great Carr clan of Scotland, who, while remembered as being one of the most loyal of clans, were also one of the most warlike. So Michael is his groundbreaking approach, much criticised at the time, to the Northern Ireland peace process, is proof that nurture overcomes nature. Michael maintains a keen interest in international affairs and is chairman of the Global Strategy Forum, an independent, non-party political forum dedicated to the promotion of fresh thinking and active debate on foreign affairs and international security issues, which he founded in 2006. Today, Michael will offer a European perspective on US foreign policy, focusing on the global effect of the pivot to the Asia-Pacific region and what the implications this may have for the future of the Euro-Atlantic relationship in the context of a volatile state of world affairs. If the US, the established power, and China, the rising power, cannot find ways to arrest and reverse their current and undesired by both sides drift towards strategic rivalry, tensions will rise. The cost of perhaps a new type of Cold War to both countries, to the region, to Europe and to the world will be significant at a time when our in-tray of problems has never been fuller. So we look forward to hearing how this is viewed from the Euro-Atlantic perspective. After Michael has made his opening remarks, we will take questions from the floor. Please identify yourself before you make the question. But as we only have 1 hour today, please welcome Lord Lothian.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. It's a great pleasure to be here. My family motto is, in Latin, is serio sed serio, which means late but in earnest. And I suppose coming here after I've retired may be an indication that I am in earnest, if a little late. But one of the extraordinary things I find, having retired from active politics, is that, particularly in international affairs, events move very fast and you're carried along by events to an extent that very often you are not in a position to. The lights are going out all over Europe. They will not be lit again in our time. Sometimes it's impossible to stand back and get a strategic view of what's happening, or indeed to create a strategy, because events take you and lead you. One of the great benefits of having retired from hands-on active involvement in international affairs is it has given me the opportunity to try and stand back, to look at the last 20 years, to say, what did we get right, what did we get wrong, what are the lessons that we should learn, and are we actually learning them? And in a sense, what Peter has set out as what I want to talk about today really relates to that. It was Winston Churchill who, in the mid-1930s, described British foreign policy as, in his words, adamant for drift. It was a typical Churchillian description of a foreign policy that had no purpose and no direction. And in a way, looking back over these last years, I feel we could almost apply the same sobriquet to Western foreign policy. And I use the word Western foreign policy very advisedly because although this is advertised as a British perspective on American foreign policy, for the last, I suppose, 60 years, British foreign policy, and to a large extent European foreign policy, has seen American foreign policy as its default position. There's very little we've done which has not followed the line that is being taken by America. So when I talk about foreign policy and drift, I'm not just talking about the United States policy, I'm talking about the policy of the West in general. And looking back at Western foreign policy since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, I can't avoid the feeling that while during the Cold War we had a clear purpose, we knew what we were about, we knew what we were defending against, we knew what we had to try and undermine. Since that threat disappeared, we retreated back into drift again. I remember the day that the wall fell and there was talk of the new dawn and new world democracy and everything else, tremendous hope. And this was largely underpinned by the fact that the United States was, in relative terms, the strongest country the world had ever seen in economic, political and military terms. And I saw a paper once which compared in relative terms the United States then to the Roman Empire, and the United States in every sense was well ahead. And there was a feeling that this was the United States' unipolar moment, when it could actually use this extraordinary position for the benefit of the world as a whole. And it began with some hope. It began, in a way, in the Balkans, where certainly in Bosnia-Herzegovina, I think we can feel that the West did a good job, the United States did a good job. It's lasting. We've saved a lot of people from a lot of suffering which was going on in the past. And that was an indication that hard power could be used effectively to create in a unipolar situation that type of outcome. But after that, I have to say, I find it very difficult to see where the purpose and the policy went. It began to drift again. It drifted into Kosovo, which my own view, and it may be controversial, is that our action in Kosovo was a mistake. It was, in international legal terms, illegal. It compromised NATO because it took NATO out of theatre into an action which had nothing to do with the purpose of NATO, which was the defence of its members. And in the end, it gave, as we know from the experience in Georgia, the Russians the ability to say in South Ossetia and in Abkhazia, well, if you can do that in Kosovo, we can do it in these countries as well. Thereafter, I think a lot of us were wondering where foreign policy was going to head. In a way, we had a rather unexpected answer, which came with 9/11. 9/11 suddenly represented an existential threat, and we were able to respond to it. And the United States responded to it very fast, joined by the British in a legal action in Afghanistan because it was under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter relating to self-defense, which allowed us eventually to bring NATO in as well behind us. And that was a clear policy which had a clear objective, which was to clear the threat of al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan, and so long as the Taliban refused to do that, to try and clear the threat of the Taliban out of Afghanistan and out of Kabul in particular as well. And we achieved that. We achieved it very effectively and very quickly. And then I have to say, I think we lost the place because we didn't know why we were staying there. If we'd said our reason for staying there is to prevent them coming back, that might have been acceptable. But we began to talk in wider terms about nation building, about introducing democracy, about education, about reconstruction, about drug eradication. And the more we talked and the more we tried to define what our role was, the more we seemed to enter a morass which has ended up with one of the longest wars that certainly in my political lifetime we've undergone. And to what purpose, I ask? I hate it when we have our forces on the ground who fought brilliantly and bravely and suffered casualties and losses to even remotely criticise. But if we are going to look back and learn lessons, then we have to be able to ask ourselves questions about what was the purpose of staying on there. I described it at one moment 5-6 years ago when I was calling at that stage for the withdrawal of British forces from Helmand, where I never thought we should have gone in the first place, as pushing water uphill. We did it brilliantly. The Americans and the British and other NATO forces actually did drive the Taliban literally up the hills into Waziristan and into the Fatah. But the trouble with pushing water uphill is when you stop pushing water uphill, it comes down again. And my fear is that when we do withdraw next year, the water we pushed uphill is simply going to return down again, and there's going to be very little that we can do about it. And one of the reasons I fear that is because for the last 6 years, when I have been critical about our involvement, continuing involvement there, I've been told we must stay there until the job is done. And I've asked over and over again, what is the job? And I've never had a satisfactory answer, and I don't have a satisfactory answer today. I was once told by a general, the job is done is when you define in your own terms the line that you're going to call victory, and the moment you pass it, whether it's victory or not, you say the job is done and you get out. But that does raise questions about roles in the future, about the purpose of foreign policy, about the purpose of hard power. Iraq, in a sense, is even more difficult, because Iraq, there was, and again, a clear purpose. It was first of all the eradication of weapons of mass destruction, although when we got there we couldn't find them. Possibly some of them are now in Syria and may yet play a role in world affairs over the coming months. And the second was regime change, which in my view, again as a lawyer, was illegal, but certainly looking back now on the conversations between George W. Bush and Tony Blair was on the agenda. Well, if that was right, we achieved both of those within the first 3 months of the invasion. And yet we stayed another 6 years and the United States stayed another 8 years. To achieve what? To achieve now an Iraq which is largely Shia dominated, which is increasingly supportive of Iran, which is always teetering on the brink of division, with the Kurds in the north effectively autonomous now, and with a Shia majority and a Sunni minority who are never going to effectively come to terms with each other. And so again, I ask, where was the purpose? What was the aim? Or was this just drift because we didn't know how to extricate ourselves from something we got into? And I give this as the background because we are now entering a new phase in terms of foreign policy. We're looking, and I'll come on to the Pacific a little later, but we're looking in terms of the European, Middle Eastern sector at a number of very serious problems. The first is Syria. And Syria, I think, is something which should trouble us all, because none of us like Assad. I think what he has done to his own people is absolutely abominable, and we should never be frightened of saying so. But we, in our support for the overthrow of Assad, have never clearly set out what we see the objective of Western foreign policy to be. We talked rather grandly about the voice of the people triumphing, about the new democracy arising out of the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening, or whatever you want to call it. But we never really defined what that meant. We've been undermined even in our own understanding of that by what has happened in Tunisia and what has happened in Egypt, because when both of those uprisings took place, we were the first people. When I say we, in this case, David Cameron himself went out to raise the arms of the people in Tahrir Square to say, we are with you. And I sent a photograph to our Foreign Secretary of him doing that and said, count the Islamic flags in the background of that photograph. And maybe then you will begin to wonder whether what you are welcoming and celebrating is quite what you think it is. And now, when we've seen the outcome of elections in Egypt, I think my fears are pretty well realized. I was in Tunis the other day, where I was very startled not only by the attack that had taken place on the American embassy a month before in that city, but by the fact that moderate Tunisians were terrified about growing Islamism in their own country. And I use it as an anecdote, but I was being shown around Tunis by a 24-year-old graduate, a girl who had been part of the uprising and was very much part of the move to try and re-educate Tunisians into a new society. And she said to me as we went around, I am terrified of what I am seeing on the streets here. Every time I go out, there are more and more women who are veiled. And I said to her, are they veiled because their husbands want them to be, because their fathers want them to be, because the state wants them to be? And she said, no, they're veiled because they want to be. And I said, why? And she said, because you've got to understand that liberation means liberating you from oppression, which prevented you from doing what you wanted to do before. And there are a lot of people here who are Islamists who believe that they were prevented from showing their religion in the past. Now part of their new freedom is to exercise it openly. And I began to get a feeling that here again we may not have been ahead of the curve on what is happening. Syria, if I can return to that, is even more dangerous, because we are now seeing a civil war in which we have decided that we are against the current regime, which means in one way or another we are aiding those who are against it as well, despite the fact that there is growing evidence, and has been for at least 2 years, that many of those who are against the regime are actually our natural enemies. They're Al-Qaeda, they are Salafist militias. They've come out of Iraq, where they were armed by the Saudis to fight the al-Sadr during the Sunni awakening 2 years ago. They're highly trained, they're well armed, and they are well financed. And the more I read, and it's not a surprise because I was warned of this 2 years ago, the more I hear that they are the forefront of the battle against Assad, because they are the best fighters, they have the best weapons, and indeed they can dominate the Free Syrian Army. They can take their weapons, they can order them around, they can tell them what to do. And so, totally accidentally, we are putting ourselves in a position where we may well be giving encouragement to the very people whom we have spent the last 20 years trying to eradicate, because they are a threat to our security in terms of the terrorism which they can produce. And I don't think that the present position is tenable. I think in one way or another we are going to get sucked further into it. And as we are going to find ourselves, if we're not careful, in a very difficult position where we may well have helped arm actual Al-Qaeda operatives in that country. And what is even more frightening is that if you read, as I try to do, all that is written about them, they're not Syrians in the sense of wanting to take over Syria. They are Islamists who believe in the Ummah and want to actually see Islamism spread across the whole of that region without boundaries. And that is the real threat if we wanted to have a purpose which we should be addressing ourselves to, but I find it very difficult at the moment to see that we are. And from there, you can move round the corner to Jordan, first of all, which is teetering on the brink of another massive upheaval which could overthrow the king, which could introduce the Muslim Brotherhood as a government to that country, and which once again could pose a threat to Western interests, because Jordan, of all places, not just in relation to Israel, where it's important, but also in relation to our interests in the area, has always been a firm friend and a steadying influence. And if that goes down, I think the repercussions will be very severe. What are we doing about it? Where are we appearing to be on that scene? I find it very difficult to see. Maybe there are things going on behind the scenes. I don't know about them, although I'm on our Intelligence and Security Committee. It worries me that somehow we have, in the heat of welcoming the Arab Spring, have forgotten to look at the details and deal with the threats that are emerging from it. And then there is another area within that region, and I'm not talking about the Maghreb. We know about the Maghreb, and I've talked about Tunisia and Egypt. I'm talking about the Saleh, to the south of that area. We hear it in the papers now because we're reading about French intervention in Mali. But if you look and study that area, you'll see that right across the whole of that band, from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, there is now a growing evidence of Islamic insurgency and of Al-Qaeda involvement. Some of it we put there ourselves when we drove the Tuaregs and Islamists out of Libya into among other places, Mali. Some of it is because as we deal with people in Yemen and in Pakistan, people are moving there, and some of it is homegrown. But what is certain is that if we're looking for an existential threat to ourselves, the concept that you could have a band of Africa, which is the nest bed of future Al-Qaeda activity, is a very real and present challenge. And yet again, other than what the French are doing at the moment. What are we seen to be doing about it? So once again, I use the word drift. I think that we are in a position now where if we continue to avoid strategic thinking about how we deal with these issues, we could well find we face very considerable difficulties in the near future, largely of our own making. Now, there are two other areas that I want to touch on this morning, other than that region. The first of them is the Pacific. 2 years ago, the word pivot appeared in the US Dictionary of International Affairs, and then soon afterwards disappeared, just as I started using it, because I thought it was the phrase to use. But I'm now told it's a shift of influence and interest that is taking place. And I have to say, looking at it, a very slow one. But it's one that I believe is increasingly going to happen. In a sense, I welcome it, because at least in terms of Obama's policy towards the Pacific, there is a clear purpose. He has identified that this is an area not only of potential threat in the future, but of increasing economic activity, as the global economic pendulum swings from the west to the east. That is going to be the centre of a lot of activity in the future. And understandably, he thinks the United States should be part of that. It is a Pacific nation as much as it's an Atlantic nation. And I totally understand that, and I certainly would not criticise it. And in fact, if it does give a clear purpose to foreign policy, well then I would actually welcome it. But it does pose enormous problems for the Europeans. And the reason I want to end in a little detail on this is that it could not be happening at a worse time for Europe. I talked earlier about NATO and the effect of going into Kosovo on NATO's credibility. It was even more undermined by going into Libya, where there was even less question of a threat to one of its members and where there were no NATO criteria for the action that took place. So already NATO is hovering on the brink of credibility, wondering whether it still has a role. If we see in the years ahead a distinct move by the United States in military terms out of Europe towards the Pacific, and given the economics of the United States at the moment, where the constricting economic demands means that any shift is going to be a zero-sum game. You can't just increase in the Pacific without having an effect somewhere else. I think the whole future of NATO could well come into question. I got into trouble yesterday for suggesting that NATO's credibility is already on the edge in terms of its own criteria. We've expanded so fast and so large that I'm not certain we could any more deliver what NATO was supposed to deliver within its own terms. And I used the example of Estonia and got roundly excoriated for doing so. I go to Estonia a lot. It's a lovely country. It's doing very well economically at the moment. But they are absolutely convinced that if the Russians came across the border, NATO would go to war with Russia in order to send them back again. I have to say, in the modern world, I think that is highly unlikely. And if it's highly unlikely, then the question is, what does Article 5 of the NATO treaty mean? And if it's not going to be applied, then what is the purpose of continuing with NATO? So I raise that question and leave it there, because part of the effect of the American shift from the Atlantic to the Pacific could be to put a question mark over NATO, to which those type of questions superimposed on it are going to finally cause it to wither on the branch. But something much more fundamental is happening in Europe than that. I've spent a lifetime in politics talking and arguing about Europe and whether Britain should be a member of the European community. We heard last week the United States wants to see us at the centre of Europe. Not a very helpful comment at this particular time. But the reality is that Europe itself is changing. Europe, which for 60 years had an almost unparalleled growth, which was unchallenged by any of the normal problems that beset economies, thought that in the end, in a sense, it was invincible. It didn't need to think about the realities. It was going to go on growing, and it would move towards its objective, which was set out in the Treaty of Rome, of ever closer union, leading eventually to a fully integrated Europe, a United States of Europe. Maybe that was on the cards 15 years ago. It is no longer on the cards at all. Europe has had to face some very grim realities, partly because of the global economic downturn, but also because of fundamental flaws in the way that it was constructed. It had an economic flaw, which is at the fore at the moment, in that it created a single currency, which was part of its move towards full integration, without the necessary adjunct of a common fiscal policy. And at the time, a lot of us told them that was going to be a recipe for future disaster. And we were told, no, in Europe it doesn't matter, we can overcome all that. Well, it hit us largely through Greece last year. It's continuing to hit us. We are now facing a situation where European leaders within the Eurozone are kicking the can further and further down the road, but they're not facing up to the reality that if they want it to continue, one day they're going to have a common fiscal policy. And a common fiscal policy in European terms means that the Italian budget will have to be cleared by the Germans before it can be passed. And if you go to Europe and you make that suggestion, you'll get a very dusty answer. And the answer is it's highly unlikely that there will ever be agreement to allow that to happen. And if it doesn't happen, then the whole continued existence of the euro comes into question. The second question that has to be looked at in terms of Europe is the way that it's being constructed. It is enormously top-heavy. It has a vast bureaucracy. It's governed by directives which, at one moment, thank goodness it's gone, related to the need to have straight rather than curved bananas, to health and safety, to human rights, right through the gamut. It runs the lives of the citizens of Europe. And yet never once in its history have the citizens of Europe been asked whether that's what they wanted. Here is a great democratic continent which has built this enormous structure, including in the United Kingdom. And not once in a realistic way have the peoples of those countries been asked in a referendum whether this is what they want to be governed by and whether the shape is what they want to see. And while things were going well, perhaps that didn't matter. But now things are going badly. The peoples of Europe are beginning to say, we want to have our say. Our Prime Minister in Britain is making a speech on Friday where I think he will announce that within the next 3-4 years we will have a referendum on our future and continued existence within the European Union. And maybe that is going to be a cathartic act which will lead to similar referendums in other countries. If we don't do that, I think we will see a continuing build-up of resentment on the ground in Europe against the concept of the European Union, which is much more dangerous than trying to restructure the European Union in a way that we can then go back to its peoples and ask them whether this is what they wanted. Now, the third element in Europe, which is the one which links me back to what I was talking about earlier, is defence. Because if we see America beginning to move away from the support that it has traditionally given Europe since the last war, the first question is, can the Europeans make up for that? And the very quick answer is no. In Britain, under a Conservative government, which traditionally has always been the friend of the armed forces, we are reducing our army to 80,000 people, 80,000 personnel, the smallest it's been for many, many generations. Not because we want to, but because we don't think we can afford to do otherwise. And this is a country which has always been at the forefront in European terms of the military input into European security. The Germans rather belatedly came to the active NATO table, prepared at least to go to Afghanistan. They are now getting considerably nervous about where this may lead. If you remember when the Libyan operation took place, the Germans very firmly said, sorry, we're not going to take part in it. And they are certainly not at the moment going to see their role as underwriting European security, certainly if that is also going to involve actions outside the European theatre. French, I don't know. The French at the moment are undergoing an austerity program, and yet they are putting troops into Mali. Maybe that's right from what I was saying earlier about dealing with that particular threat. But in the long term, I don't see the French being able to replace the American input into European security. The other countries of Europe, Poland perhaps apart, are certainly not politically going to up their ante on security. Most of those countries, if they were really to make a proper contribution to replacing the American input into European security, would have to increase their defence budgets by somewhere between 150 and 200%. And can you imagine, at a time of austerity, any prime minister of any European country going to their people and saying, we want to increase the defence budget and we're going to take it off welfare and we're going to take it off housing and we're going to take it off all the other things that matter to people. The answer is it's not going to happen. So the worry about the move away from Europe to the Pacific for us is that we are going to end up with a Europe that simply is not able to conduct its own security in the way that it has in the past. Now, does that matter? Is there a real threat against which we must guard in Europe at the moment? I'm not certain, at least for the present, that there is. Do we need to be involved in some of the actions we've been involved in the Middle East, or should we concentrate through special forces, for instance, on dealing with the existential threats I was talking about earlier? I suspect that we could get away with using special forces with the qualification that you only get decent special forces if you have a large enough standing army to recruit them from. So there's a slight downside there. So it may be that what is happening isn't going to matter. But what I am suggesting is, because of the drift that has taken place, because all this has happened without anybody thinking out the grammar of it, we are changing the nature of security within the Western world in a way which is dramatic in comparison to the past. And I wonder whether that is not something which we should address ourselves to very seriously before it's too late to do something about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Classically real, thoughtful, and very worrying remarks. Much appreciated. Now to take questions from the audience. Can you please identify yourself and ask a question, not make a statement, please? Starting over here.
Yes, I'm Bronco Terzic with the Deloitte Center for Energy. Michael, you obliquely referred to the country, but you didn't. You obliquely referred to a country, but you didn't specify it, and that is Russia. We had a presidential candidate here losing that indicated Russia was the #1 enemy or problem that the United States had internationally. Implied in your comment is that it's not NATO's main problem, but if you'd expand a little bit.
Yes, I mean, I think President Putin has set a fairly serious problem for the West, as we know, in terms of his attitude towards Iran, his attitude towards Syria, his growing attempts to corral again the southern ex-Soviet states, what I call the stans, under the Russian influence, and doing it relatively successfully at the moment. His new friendship with China, which is rather an interesting development given some of what's happened over the last 10 years. In terms of potential surprise, I suppose you could regard him as a threat. But I don't see him as an existential threat. I think, in a way, he could well be an opportunity. If I was, which I'm not, advising the United States president, I would say, might it not be worthwhile to try and enter dialogue with President Putin about what the United States and Russia can do jointly in Iran, what the United States and Russia could do jointly in terms of trying to calm things down in Syria, and in terms of what is happening in the Pacific, is there a joint interest between the United States and Russia in making sure that China doesn't become too powerful? And I rather suspect that if that was the approach that was made, rather than the hands-off approach that seems to be what is in place at the moment, that we might see progress being made. I don't think Putin is anti-Western. I think he's anti-being humiliated. I think he's anti-being sort of patted on the head. If he is made to feel that he's part of a genuine process, I think he could be actually co-opted into becoming a constructive part of what a foreign policy which is no longer drifting but has a purpose could achieve.
Thank you. My name is John Alexio. I'm a business consultant. Every 100 years or so, there's a sharp transformation. We had one of the 20th century. The European Union is supposed to unite the Europeans, stop the wars. But right now, they vacillate between their economies, and might be a collapse or may not be a collapse. Do you think it will succeed? And also, another one which begin now to come up is that the currency wars. And the currency wars is between the dollar, the euro, and the Chinese currency. could that become the next global crisis? Thank you, sir, and your comments.
I think the Chinese currency and the American currency, I'm not an expert on it, but I think that is likely to be an area of contention because the Chinese have been, if you like, playing outside the rules in terms of the way that they've conducted their currency. And that has actually caused enormous problems for the United States. And at some moment that actually has to be resolved. And maybe the Chinese will, in the end, see it's not to their advantage to go on provoking that type of currency crisis, particularly as they own a lot of the American debt at the moment, and they could well be cutting off their noses to spite their faces. The euro, at the moment it's there. At the moment it's relatively strong. But I seriously question whether in 5 years' time the euro as we know it as a single currency will continue to exist. If you go around Europe at the moment, you go up to the Baltic states and Poland, which are being successful in economic terms. They've got healthy growth. And they say, why should we have a currency which is tied to basket cases like Greece, potentially Italy, especially if Mr. Bersani wins the forthcoming election, and Spain? And they talk openly about why can't we have two currencies within Europe? Ours a strong currency at the northern end, underpinned by the Germans and the Balkan countries and Poland, and let the rest of Europe deal with their problems under another currency dispensation to the south. So I don't see the euro as playing that type of significant role in any future conflict. The European Union itself, it was created to avoid war, and it has. And I congratulate it on that. I think giving it the Nobel Peace Prize was perhaps a little bit over the top. But it did. It brought people together who for generations had been going to war with each other. But, that's 60 years ago. And if you go to Greece now and talk to them about the Germans, you wouldn't think that there is any friendship. The tensions that are growing now within Europe could become very fundamental. And I think that's why we have to, in our European terms, look very closely at the future structure. Somebody said to me the other day, well, you may end up with a Europe which will have a very closely coordinated core, full integration between Germany and France and possibly the Benelux countries. Go to France and ask them whether they want to be integrated with Germany, and you've got a very swift answer. And so the idea that you are going to somehow continue this dream of moving towards integration and no more war within Europe is nonsense. I don't think there will be war within Europe. But I think the sort of tensions that we are creating at the moment and kicking down the path because we can't see how to resolve them are more likely to lead to argument than to try and do something about it.
Harry Blaney, Center for International Policy and former American diplomat. I question one part of your assumption, and that is the breaking down of Europe and the part that has to do with the American interest and American statement that was made in London recently by our Assistant Secretary, saying that in short, that America thinks that not only UK should stay in Europe, but that a strong Europe is still of vital interest to the United States. And it seems to me that that statement, which has been true since the end of the World War II, still stands with respect to the relationship with the UK, which is growing highly Eurosceptic, as you know. So the real question that's at work is that America's, I think, fundamental judgment has been and will continue to be for a united, peaceful Europe, for a strong NATO, and probably a NATO that does, in fact, have out of area. I served in the U.S. mission to the U.S. To NATO at one stage. Have out of area responsibilities, and that may be one of the purposes and the focus, because the European security and the security of the United States and North America may in fact depend on NATO forces and NATO unity on dealing with security issues. And I'm concerned because your point seems to be an element that a breaking apart may be a part of an answer, while we think on our side that coming together and strengthening that, including a strong presence on the part of the UK, is vital. And I would like to see your argument of why we are wrong.
On NATO, if I could deal with that first, I mean, I think if we are going to look at changing the role of NATO, we actually need to change the role. I think what has been dangerous, and I'm supported in this by a lot of our very senior military in Britain, is that we use NATO in a way for which it was not created and which it is not underwritten by the treaty. If we're saying we are going to be a police force in a general area and make ourselves available to become involved in conflicts outside the European theatre, then that should be part of what we set out as the purpose of NATO. It isn't at the moment. And I do think... Yeah.
Which I agree with. And it seems to me that NATO has to adapt to that framework.
Well, the question that arises, and I can't answer it, is to what extent the so-called pivot takes place. If the pivot was genuine in terms of moving American military resources from the Atlantic theatre to the Pacific theatre, then the ability of NATO to continue is going to be severely compromised, literally just by lack of resources. So we're looking at an uncertainty there. In terms of what your Assistant Secretary said the other day, I think what was unhelpful was the sort of, well, first of all, he said we shouldn't have a referendum. And I think that's a dangerous thing to say to a democracy, that you shouldn't ask your people what they think because you might get the wrong answer. The Irish are very good at that. They have referendums. If they get the wrong answer, they say, we'll go on having referendums until you give us the right answer, which they've done on a number of occasions. But I think it was a mistake for him to get involved in that argument, particularly as I genuinely think the lack of democratic evaluation of Europe is part of its fundamental weakness at the moment. The second is that I don't think Europe is a case of either a fully integrated United States of Europe or no Europe at all. I think there are all sorts of different Europes. I mean, I started my student days listening to De Gaulle talking about the Europe des patries. I began my political career talking about a partnership of sovereign nations, in which you would trade freely across borders, you would cooperate mutually on matters of common interest, but you would retain your rights of self-determination. My leader, when I was the deputy leader of the Conservative Party, Michael Howard, talked about variable geometry. He would have a Europe of different speeds in different directions, and that may still be an option that's open, particularly when you look at what's happening in Greece and the Mediterranean littoral in terms of their ability to contribute to the structures of Europe effectively over the coming months. So it isn't just a question of saying no Europe or a strong Europe with Britain in the middle of it. There are all sorts of questions that need to be asked. And I think his assumption, which hurt us in Britain, was that our friendship with the United States depended on us being in Europe. And there were many people who said to me just after he made that comment, we didn't hear that comment when George W. Bush went into Iraq, and the only Europeans who went with him were the British. It wasn't a question then of European coordinated action behind him. He very gratefully received the assistance of the British in taking part in that operation. It expanded after that. But it was the British ability and willingness to support the Americans rather than their European dimension that made that possible. Last comment I'd make is this, and you may say I'm a chauvinist. My grandmother was Italian. I'm British. When I'm in Italy, I feel intensely Italian. When I'm in Britain, I feel intensely British. I do not feel European, and nor do most people in Europe. And that's really the difference between the United States of America and Europe. Europe is a series of different countries with distinct histories, with distinct cultures, with distinct languages, which are never going to come together as one and say we are European and put our hands on our hearts and salute the European flag. That was a dream which was, in my view, never going to happen. I think what's happened over the last 2 years is that people who thought that that dream was going to happen are now beginning to realize it's not. And the reality is that we have to face up to that and find a different format to make sure that Europe is available to provide the type of strengths you're talking about in the future.
Take one at the back.
Thanks. Michael Geary. I'm a fellow here in the Wilson Centre in European Studies. You started your earlier comments discussing the flaws, I suppose, in American foreign policy vis-a-vis the Arab Spring and many of these Middle Eastern countries, but you didn't really put your I suppose, give us maybe your own opinion as to why there are these flaws. I mean, we see how the American administration during the 80s part-funded Osama bin Laden's campaign against, various other anti-interest to Americans, and then that relationship soured. So where do you see the flaws in the American approach to the Middle East? And, I've lectured for years on how Americans sometimes view the world as very black and white and avoid the grey areas. So perhaps you can maybe look at see where the Obama administration perhaps is changing. Then on the European question, I will disagree with you. I think because I think you're presenting a very British perspective on Europe, and I think the British have always been happier, or the British have always been more pro-European when they've been trying to get in, and when they've gotten in, of course, they haven't exactly been happy. But if you were advising David Cameron, if you were writing his speech for him on Friday, what would you say? What would you put into it? And what would you like to see happening vis-a-vis Britain's relationship with Europe? Thanks.
How long have we got to answer that question? I think in very simple terms, I think what David Cameron has got to say, and I think it will ring bells with other leaders in Europe, whether they'll admit it publicly or not, is that, as I said earlier, that the project of European unity has certainly ground to a halt and may well have ended in terms of being achievable. And therefore it is the responsibility of European leaders now to get together to say, is there a better Europe that we can construct? And I would also say that you don't do that by what I call salami slicing, by clawing back powers to various countries, because we've learnt in the past you can do that, but very soon afterwards the clawing back can be reversed and they all go back into the centre again. You have to fundamentally look at Europe. We missed that opportunity. I mean, after Lisbon gave us the opportunity to sit down and say we are going to actually create a new vision of Europe. And that was what the Convention on the Constitution was supposed to do. And it didn't because Giscard d'Estaing, who again is an old friend of mine, had what he described in French as his moment philadelphique, when he saw himself as one of the founding fathers of the United States. And he wrote a constitution which was largely trying to create in his mind that for the future. And it was something which was not going to happen. And what was most extraordinary was that when the French were asked, the majority of 60 to 40 against it in a referendum made it clear that the French didn't think it was going to happen either. We have got the ability within Europe to sit down and say, we may have to muddle along for the moment. We've got the time to sit down and say we are going to look at the structures of Europe and how we build a Europe which is actually sustainable in the future. And it may be a Europe of different speeds and different geometries. But unless we actually face up to asking those questions and fundamentally studying them, we're going to go on muddling along. And so my view is that David Cameron should be saying not that I want to get out of Europe, and he's not going to say that, but that I want to be in a Europe that has more chance of succeeding in the future than the Europe I'm actually living in at this particular moment of the present. And if I was Angela Merkel, I think I would listen very closely to what the German people are saying to her, because a lot of them are saying precisely the same thing, and I think the French would probably be saying the same to President Hollande. We have that opportunity. I hope we will now take it. On the Middle East, yes, I mean, I'm fascinated by the Middle East because, as you know, my enemy's enemy is my friend, and that changes from day to day. And you're right, we backed Osama bin Laden. Israel backed Hamas. When Hamas was founded, Israel backed it because they thought it was going to be a thorn in Yasser Arafat's side. Changing alliances are part of the way the Middle East works. But where I think we fundamentally lost the place was we didn't see the distinction, which I think is a very important one, between what I call universal Islam, which is a genuine, if you like, religious political movement with all sorts of cultural attachments to it, that sees the duty of those who are part of it as creating a worldwide Islamic situation, what they call the Ummah. I mean, in practical terms, they wouldn't look beyond going through past North Africa and the region at the moment. Those are the dangerous people to us. The Taliban may be unpleasant, but the Taliban effectively are people who are interested in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. Hamas, who some of you may know I met on a number of occasions, are actually interested in Palestine. They're not interested in the wider Ummah. The people who are fighting in Syria at the moment, and I was reading an article about them this morning written by a Saudi journalist who's been talking to some of the Islamists there, they are a danger because they are saying openly, we are not interested in ruling Syria. We're interested in creating an Islamic force within Syria, which can then spread outwards from there across other areas. And they're quite open about that. They are a threat. And in a way, I think we've avoided identifying over the last few years where our real interests lie and where they don't lie within what's happening in that part of the world. There is another side to this. When Tahrir Square took place, I remember our leader went out and talked about the voice of the people must be heard. This is what democracy is about. If the people want something, we must back it. He went 3 months later to Bahrain, and he didn't say anything of the sort when he got there, because applying that same judgment to Bahrain would have meant supporting a Shia administration in Bahrain, which would very soon be in cahoots with the eastern Saudis, which are largely Shia as well, which would very soon be in cahoots with Iraq and eventually with Iran. Not in our interest suddenly to listen to the voice of the people anymore. And so our message became very indistinct. And I think that also was a mistake. And the result of all this, I have to say, and it pains me, when I was in Tunisia, which I really did expect to find the French roundly loathed because of their past there, which I did. But I didn't expect to find the Americans and the British roundly loathed, which I also found. And they don't like us because they think we don't understand them, and we think that in the end of the day we're playing games with them.
Final question.
Thank you. Marshall Miller. In your discussions on Europe, you didn't mention demographics and the fact that many people in France not only don't feel European, many of them don't feel French, and Germans don't feel German. This is a very important factor, it would seem. Could you enlighten us on your views on this subject?
Yeah, it's a moving target, that. I mean, I can speak about it really from the British experience. When Poland became part of the European Union, the French and the Germans quite cleverly exercised an opt-out for 7 years about the free transfer of labour. So they were able to stop the Poles coming in vast numbers to their country. So they came to Britain. We were told, I was our spokesman in Parliament, we were told 13,000 of them would come. When we got to 540,000 2 years later, we stopped counting. And they had a dramatic effect on what was happening in Britain. They revived the Roman Catholic Church because they filled all the pews in those churches. They had tremendous skills in terms of plumbing and being electricians. They provided a lot of benefits. Equally, they caused enormous strains on housing, on education, and so on. And we were just beginning to say, what do we do about this, when the Polish economy recovered and the British economy went down and they all went home again. So it is a moving target, and I think we're going to find the same to an extent in terms of internal movement within the European Union, in France and in Germany as well. We're about to face the question of what will happen to Romanians, who may well decide to take the same paths into France and Germany and Britain as did the Poles, and that's going to cause problems as well. But in the end, I think that is likely to resolve itself because people in the end will return to the cultures they know and they understand. What is much more concerning is immigration from outside. The European Union, one of its great claims to fame was the Schengen Agreement, which we never joined, whereby you could move from one country to another without having to show a passport. And this worked until 2 years ago when what was happening in Tunisia and Libya began to create enormous waves of immigrants coming across the sea, coming across that short part of the Mediterranean into southern Italy, and then up through southern Italy, through France. And if they'd been able, into Britain, we managed to stop that. But the effect has been that the Germans and the French have now, for the moment, suspended the Schengen Agreement so far as movement from Italy into their countries are concerned. So they are facing up to what is, again, a real threat of demographic movement, over which they have no control. And their reaction to it is not to increase the powers and abilities of the European Union, but to decrease them. So I think we have to look at that very closely. But as I say, it's a moving target. In our case, in Britain, our biggest immigration doesn't actually come from Europe. It still comes from the Indian subcontinent.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think from the questions you can see we could probably have gone on for another hour. I hope you'll come back soon and for longer. But in the meantime, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.